So today I'd like to share with you a project that was in shop for a little while. A little surprising how long, but it was mostly trying to track down all the parts. You generally think a Toyota is easy to get parts, but this is a Mark III Supra, so 86. So this is the first of the bespoke Supras. Customer knew he had a fluid leak, but we put on the rack first just to see what all's going on. And it is a high mileage car. Unfortunately, the power steering system showed it, and you kind of see the early videos where we're just looking at what's leaking. So coming out of the rack like that just says the internal seals for the rack are shot, so there's really no point in trying to reseal anything. And if you put a boot on it, it's just going to pressurize the boot eventually and pop out. So it was time for a new rack. The pump definitely showed signs that it was leaking also, just seeping out of multiple areas. So it really was just time to rebuild the whole system. So we got new pump, new rack, all new hoses, and yeah, even new tie rod ends, but you got to take them off anyway, so you might as well replace. We also replaced the vacuum control valve and replaced all the rubber hoses with that, with some new silicone pieces. So
I can't get it out.
Getting there.
Worst thing is, if you take pulley off first, they'd probably come out. And drop your sway bar.
Yeah, that wouldn't be too bad.
It'll mess.
So one reason to rebuild an entire system, power steering system, when you do something like this is to just not have contaminated fluid anywhere in the system. Some vehicles you're replacing every line anyway, like an old American car or something, but this particular case there was actually a lot of hard lines that were still left, and some even left in place. There's a hard line that forms a loop in front of the radiator. It's just a cooler for it. There's another one across the frame member from the steering input side to passenger side, and just dawned on me probably the Japanese version has a lot less lines because it would be laid out a little different. Anyway, this particular one does still have a lot of lines. We didn't flush everything out because the amount of fluid he had gone through before bringing it in, the power steering fluid was actually really clean. And we knew the system had been flushed a few years before when it had a broken line on the return side. So anyway, just keep that in mind, as you may want to be flushing out all those lines. It may be easier to take them out of the car. That's kind of up to the individual situation, but make sure you have clean fluid going in. And you may also void your warranty on either your pump or rack if you don't. So the steering rack rebuilder actually claimed that they had already centered the rack, so you should be able to drop it in, steering wheel and all that should line up, which, let's face it, that's never the case. Things get bumped in shipping. So always recheck that. And on a car like this, just assume you're going to have to pull the steering wheel, so make sure you have that capability also. And luckily this one doesn't need a puller or anything fancy, but it's still a little bit tedious. Make sure your rack's centered, turn to turn, and then start doing your toe-in adjustments. Shouldn't need to do camber or caster. Should all be. It isn't changed with this job, but if there's any question with it, you should check that while you already have it on some alignment plates. So I did find this Supra a little difficult to bleed, the power steering system. I tried it initially with wheels on the lift, just full load on it. You can get away with that with a lot of older style systems, but this one, it did not start the prime in the pump. But once lifted it up in the air, so if you're doing this like drive weights, leave it up on your jack stands. turn it a couple times, you'll actually hear, make sure you overfill the reservoir. So I went right to the top, not the full line, because you know that fluid's going to be pulled in, and you're going to need more. But anyway, once it was cycled a couple times, I could hear the pump cavitating. It was pulling air, so at least I know the fluid's in there. And at that point, went and actually filled it up. The pump was actually primed enough it was recirculating, and just kept feeding it with the engine still running, and that got rid of most all the air. And then it just needed to cycle a little more to see if there's any more big bubbles, and yeah, took it for a drive. So we've seen people say that you've got to turn it back and forth like 20 times unloaded, another 10 times loaded. I think they're just making more work for themselves, but hey, I guess they're erring on the side of caution and doing a thorough job. So part of the difficulty with this system is just the overall complexity. You got a remote reservoir, so you got two lines from that, one directly to a pump, that's your suction line, and then of course pressure line from the pump to feed the rack, and then the rack has two lines that go across it to actually put the pressure in different areas from its control valve. And then from the main part of the input to the rack, you also have a line that goes back over to the pump side of the car, then in front of the radiator, then back into the reservoir. So just remember to, if you're going to replace everything like we did here, you've got multiple pieces of rubber line. We got one power steering hose kit that had to be cut from Napa. It fit all the small lines. So the only thing it didn't find line-wise was the large suction side from the reservoir to the pump, but we actually used it was twist lock hose, but it's something we had at the shop that's rated for that type of fluid. It is not rated for pressure on a power steering system, but the suction side is obviously not an issue. So since we worked on the control valve system on the power steering on this Supra, thought I'd verify it was working right. So off the left-hand side of the car, the intake manifold, there is a small line that comes off that across the front of the engine and into the control valve on the power steering pump. So what that control valve is doing is when you've got steering input to where there's pressure demand on the system, it opens the control valve and creates a controlled vacuum leak back into the air intake of the system. So the idea there is they're trying to step up the idle a little bit under load and low condition or slow conditions. Higher speed, the amount of that vacuum leak could be trivial enough. It probably won't affect it, but it's also one of the this era of car, it's good to have all those systems working right, because the engine ECU doesn't have much for adaptive learn type capabilities, so it's not gonna, it'll work best if everything works as it did from the factory. Now, if you got one of these Supras and you're gonna put an aftermarket ECU in it, this is probably a system you can easily get rid of. Probably just disconnect the lines, leave the valve in place if you want it, but in this particular case, we made sure it was working. So you can see the vacuum gauge on that line pops up when I turn it. A vacuum pump like that has the check valve, which I just released, but that's showing that there's no vacuum on that side of the valve while sitting there, and with just a tiny bit of steering input, that's popping up just as it should be. This car right now, the owner's going to be going through the ignition and stuff like that, so the lowest I could get it to idle was 1,000 RPM, so it really didn't affect it much as far as bumping up the idle, but it also didn't lug the car at all. It's very, very nice power steering system. You really don't have to put a lot of input to it, or at least now that it's fully rebuilt. So anyway, hope all of this may help you out on your own projects or explain the Mark III Toyota Supra power steering a little better for you, but as usual, thanks for watching.